Back in 1965, a group of 6 teenage boys made worldwide news and were eventually dubbed the real-life Lord of the Flies. These boys made a single decision that caused them to go through what could only be described as the worst 15 months of their lives. This is the horrifying and true story of the Tongan Castaways and how 6 teenagers managed to survive through 15 months of pure hell. Their story begins on the island of Tongatapu, where 6 boys whose ages range from 13 to 16 were all present in class at the St. Andrew's Anglican boarding school. The boys were named Mano Totau, Sione Fataua, Stephen Fatai, Kolo Fekitoa, David Fifita, and Luke Vekoso. Now, school for these boys wasn't like school for most kids their age, and in a way, it too could be considered a scary ordeal. Not only were they trapped on a very tiny island that was part of a conglomerate of islands known as the Kingdom of Tonga in the middle of the ocean, but they were also not at a regular school. I'm sure you've heard the horror stories from your parents or grandparents about attending boarding school. Well, it turns out a lot of those stories are true, and the nuns and priests who ran those schools typically did so with the Bible in their hand that they were ready to use as a weapon. Catholic boarding schools were notoriously strict, and the teachers often implemented physical punishments that vastly outweighed the offense that the student was being punished for. This means that day in and day out, while they were supposed to be learning, these boys and the others who attended the school were at risk of receiving a concussion from being hit over the head with the Bible. This mistreatment led the 6 teenagers to make a decision that they viewed as their only way out of what probably seemed more like a prison than a home. The boys all decided to run away together and escape from their home and hopefully move on with their lives. Little did the 6 teenagers realize at the time that they were going to face some unbelievable obstacles before they would ever consider themselves free. The first of which happened to be the question, how do you run away on an island? Well, the answer that the teens came up with wasn't a moral one, and on the day that they chose to run away, they actually stole a boat from an older fisherman. They waited until lunchtime and then made their escape. Stealing the boat was actually easier for the boys than you might expect, because the man was apparently very mean to them, so they didn't feel too bad. Now, believe it or not, the boys had a plan when they first set sail, but it wasn't as well thought out as they had hoped. After stealing the fisherman's boat, the 6 teenagers set sail toward what they thought was Fiji, where they believed they could start fresh and hopefully live a decent life. The first problem with the boys' plan was that they only packed a few supplies for their voyage. This included some fruit like bananas and coconuts, and a small gas burner to presumably cook any fish that they might catch. That's all they thought to bring though. There wasn't a single map or compass among the group, yet they still planned to sail across the open ocean from their tiny island to Fiji. This would have been quite the adventure had the boys actually been prepared, but I'm not sure if they actually knew how far Fiji was from their home. All in all, if the journey had been successful, they would have had to travel 474 miles across the open sea with minimal supplies. The naivete of the boys took over though, and they fully believed that the trip was possible, and with their spirits high, they officially set sail. The boys likely celebrated on the boat as they started their journey, but after all the time they had spent in school that week and studying, they were all pretty tired. That's why, only a few miles away from their home, they decided to anchor the boat and sleep for the night. The gentle swaying of the boat from the waves made it easy for the teens to relax, and one by one, they drifted off. The boys slept for a couple of hours before being woken up by the sound and motion of violent waves as they slammed into the boat. To the group of runaways' horror, they unintentionally anchored themselves right in the path of a massive storm. Waves crashed into the side of the boat, and the boys all went into a panic as they tried to get a grip on the situation. But it was too late. Before they could do anything, the storm broke the rope that tethered the anchor to the boat, and it wasn't long after that the sail and rudder were destroyed as well. Lucky for the boys though, the boat managed to stay upright through the storm, and by the time it passed, they had all survived. Only now, they were drifting out in the middle of the ocean, with no way to determine or control their direction. The fate of these 6 boys was officially up to the currents. For the next 8 days, the boys simply drifted along with the current and did what they could to try to survive. They attempted to collect rainwater in one of the hollowed-out coconuts that they had brought, but they didn't get much. According to a source, they only ever had enough water for each of the boys to have a single sip in the morning and a single sip before bed. To make things worse, they took turns fishing as they drifted along, but didn't manage to catch a single one. As the days passed, and with their boat at the mercy of the waves, it was slowly starting to fall apart. All of them knew that it wouldn't be long before they had no choice but to get into the water and hope to be rescued. Though everyone knows that wouldn't have been likely to happen. Suddenly, on the 8th day of drifting, the boys spotted what was sure to seem like a miracle for them. On the horizon, they could see a small island that only spanned about half a mile. The island appeared to be surrounded by steep cliffs and littered with rocky beaches. That being said, the boys realized that their only chance at survival was to make it to that island, but they couldn't do it in the boat. One by one, Mano, Sione, Stephen, Kolo, David, and Luke jumped into the water, and using planks that they salvaged from the boat, they swam toward the island. It's said that it took nearly 36 hours for Mano to reach land, and he was the first one. Despite not being able to stand due to hunger and dehydration, Mano yelled out to the rest of the group that he had made it safely. It wasn't long before he was joined by the rest of the group, as they were all prepared to use the skills they learned growing up on an island like Tongatapu to the test. These boys had no idea just how long they would be trapped on that island, but they knew that survival was the key. They were all obviously desperate for food and water, but their struggle was only just beginning. At first, they tried to catch seabirds for their meat, and on the few occasions that they actually got one, they even drank its blood for the nutrients. At that point, all the boys had on them was an old knife blade and the skills that they had learned on their home island of Tonga. With this, they managed to dig out a small cave for themselves to use as shelter, and even started a fire that they were diligent enough to keep going for the entire time they were there. As time went on, with their skills, the boys eventually managed to set up a small food garden for themselves that would eventually help sustain them. For a freshwater source, they gathered up hollowed-out tree trunks that they then used to catch rainwater, which kept them all hydrated while they were on the island. They eventually even had a pen that they used to keep chickens that they caught in them, which they used for eggs. The boys ended up dividing their work duties evenly, with 2 of them working on the food and cooking, 2 of them working on the gardening system, and the final 2 being on guard duty, meaning that they had very little time for relaxation, at least not at first. Eventually, the boys would become more comfortable, and at one point even built a makeshift badminton set. Now, even though these boys were in a terrifying situation, they came up with an amazing system to keep themselves calm and friends. If any of them were to get too upset or angry, they had a policy that the person who was disgruntled would take a time out. This means they would be left alone for the next couple of hours while they cooled off. Believe it or not, this turned out to be a great system because all of the boys managed to get along and work really well together as they survived over the next 15 months. The boys all managed to keep their spirits up by singing at night and praying when they had the time. All in all, they were doing the best they could with what little they had. And to think that they were only between 13 and 16 years old is crazy. About 3 months into their survival, their lives managed to get a bit easier when they discovered an old village left behind by the island's old inhabitants. Near the village, they also found more food sources by way of bananas and wild taro. Now, just because they were starting to live comfortably on the island doesn't mean they wanted to be stuck there. The boys apparently spent a couple of months on the island building a raft that they hoped to sail away on. However, it hardly made it off the island before being smashed to pieces by waves crashing down on it. To make things worse for the boys, as they were looking around the island for more resources, one of them accidentally slipped and fell, breaking his leg. Now, for most people on a deserted island, a broken leg would be a death sentence, but these boys were determined. They managed to climb back down the cliff and then carry their friend back up it. Once they were at the top, they reset the broken leg and then stabilized it using sticks, twigs, and leaves. He wasn't able to work for a while, but his leg ended up healing quite well. For a total of 15 months, these boys were trapped on an island that they didn't even know the name of. And if I'm being honest, It was pure luck that they were ever found at all. This is where the story shifts perspective a bit, to the point of view of Peter Warner. He was the son of Arthur Warner, who happened to be one of the richest men in Australia at the time. Growing up, Peter was always expected to one day take over his father's business, which was involved in the manufacturing of radios. However, Peter wasn't very keen on taking over the family business, and he was more interested in finding his own passion. Of course, that also included spending as much time as he could relaxing and drinking. In a way, Peter was a lot like the teens who had become castaways. However, I don't think anyone could have expected Peter's lack of interest in his father's work to put him on the path to save those lost boys. You see, eventually, Peter decided to spend multiple years of his life sailing around the world. He visited places like Stockholm, Sweden, all the way to Hong Kong. He was able to do this because he promised his father that he would learn something that he could turn into a sensible career. However, he was more interested in the adventure and thrill of the open sea. Peter Warner eventually returned home after 5 years, but his love for the sea kept calling him back. He frequently went on fishing trips, which eventually led him to the waters surrounding Tonga. It was the winter of 1966, more than a year after the boys had disappeared. After his fishing trip was over, he decided to take a small detour before returning to Australia, and he was surprised to find an island that he didn't recognize. Little did he know, this island happened to be inhabited by a group of people who desperately needed his help. Peter slowly continued to pass the island, but out of curiosity, decided to take a closer look at it through his binoculars. He was shocked when he noticed strange burn patterns on the cliff face, as if there had been controlled fires there. This was strange for a few reasons, one being that wildfires weren't very common in high humidity and rainy places, like tropical islands. The other reason was that if the burns were from wildfires, they would be much more random and span a longer area than the burn marks he was seeing. Just as Peter continued to look around, though, he noticed something that shocked him even more. As he was looking toward the brush near the beach, a young boy popped out of it. The sailor was taken aback by the boy who had hair down to his shoulders and wasn't wearing any clothes. Little did he realize he was looking at one of the Tongan castaways. As their stories intersected, the boy who saw Peter's boat immediately rushed into the water and began swimming toward it. At first, Peter was very concerned for his own safety because at that time, some countries would strand prisoners or criminals on deserted islands as their punishment. Peter wasn't sure who the person swimming toward him was, so he prepared himself for the worst. The boy, who turned out to be Stephen Fatai, approached the boat and in very clear and well-spoken English introduced himself. He said, "I'm Stephen. There are 6 of us, and we believe we've been stranded for nearly 15 months. Peter was still surprised by the entire situation, and before putting himself in any more danger, he decided to radio the capital of the Tongan Islands. The operator was ecstatic to hear that someone had found the boys and confirmed to Peter that they were in fact castaways. Now, as I've said, by this point in time, the boys had all been missing for 15 months, and at the time, everyone believed that they were dead. Even their families believed it, with all of the boys having funerals held in their honor. After learning that Stephen was telling the truth, Peter and Stephen took a smaller boat to the shore to gather up the rest of the teenagers and bring them safely home. It's needless to say, Peter was shocked at what he saw, because by the end of their 15-month journey on the island, the boys had made a relatively sustainable home for themselves. After the boys were recovered, it was revealed that they had drifted nearly 200 miles away from their home and wound up shipwrecked on the island of Ata. The island had always been considered beautiful, and up until 1863, it was actually inhabited by the same people who left the remnants that the boys used for survival. Many people often wonder if the boys felt any sadness as they left the island that they lived on more than a year, but it's more likely that they were just excited to get home. However, not everyone was excited to see them, and the boys' tough journey wasn't over yet. As the boys and Peter left the island of Ata, they sailed to Tonga, where he was going to drop the boys off. However, before reaching the port, Peter's boat was met by authorities. They boarded the boat, and instead of making sure that the boys were safe, they placed them in handcuffs. Remember how this journey started for the Tonga Castaways? They stole a boat. Well, it turned out that the old fisherman that they stole it from wasn't willing to let bygones be bygones and wanted to press charges. That means their island prison was quickly replaced by a real jail cell in Tonga. Lucky for the boys, Peter Warner saw potential in them, both as employees and as moneymakers who had a story. He used his family's connections in the radio industry to spread the story of the Tongan Castaways, and eventually sold the rights to the boys' story to a movie company and a TV station in Australia. He even paid the old fisherman back for his boat and ensured that the boys were released. After all that Peter had done, the King of Tonga even gave the sailor the right to trap lobsters in Tongan waters, which allowed him to start a company for himself. A company that he actually used to employ the boys. The Tongan Castaways eventually became lobster fishermen for Peter and helped him spread their story. Better yet, he kept them away from the abusive boarding school that they tried so desperately to escape. The story of the Tongan Castaways is one that shows just how well people of any age can work together in the means of survival. But what do you think? Would you be able to survive on the island of Atoll for 15 months like these teenagers? Be sure to let me know in the comments below.